you ever watched a movie and felt like not only had you seen it before, but like the person who made the movie had seen it before? I watched Immaculate recently and it gave me this exact feeling. Every moment of the film reminded me of something else. A string of contrived images nabbed from other films. Inside, Hereditary, The Exorcist, American Horror Story, Rosemary's Baby, As Above, So Below, somewhat obviously, The Nun. None of it felt earned, none of it felt like it belonged to this particular movie because it lacked an identity. So what is there to belong to? I rarely bag on stuff that I don't like because I am a genuine believer that we make the world a better place by talking about stuff that is good and stuff that we do like. But Immaculate scratched such a nerve for me, so much so that I went to bed and bolted it upright at about 2 a.m. and wrote down 5 pages of notes. So given that I am working on a longer video currently and have unfortunately been stitched up with a little bit of a gap because I had to take my last video down, I thought it was the perfect time for a bit of spontaneous ranting. Also in the teeny weeny chance that you are the director or writer of this film and you found this video, don't watch it. You don't need to hear my opinion. But for the rest of us, let's get into Immaculate, and I'm going to explain some of the issues I had with it and what I think the rest of us can learn from it. The biggest thing here to me, because I feel like it blows the lid off the whole plot, is that the story revolves around one huge contrivance. Is that a word? In Immaculate, they have to trick and deceive Sydney into having God's genetic baby. But in real life, people do crazy shit for religion all the time, and you cannot tell me people would not be lining up out the door to have God's actual child. But to give this film tension, they settled on tricking a character into having the baby who doesn't want it so that the film can actually have some push and pull as she learns what's happening to her and tries to get away. But this wouldn't be necessary in reality, I don't think, even in the reality of the story. So many other people within the context of the stories, the other nuns like Isabel, would have offered their bodies for this. And even the film makes the mistake of letting us know that because they have Isabel attack Sydney and scream the line, "It should have been me." And they kind of try to justify this with like a "you're special" situation because Cecilia died and came back to life when she was 12. But like, I know a guy who did that. That's not that special. Okay, it is special. But my point is, it just wasn't a good enough reason in my eyes for them to specifically choose her. The film also directly tells us that they've done this to other girls. We see another nun at the convent running away at the beginning, and we see her body later, showing that ultimately her pregnancy led to her death. So did this girl get the same treatment as Cecilia? Did every girl who was impregnated get the same big procession and the cool little fancy Mary dress? Does this mean the nuns at the convent have done this a bunch of times? The sciencey priest says that they've been doing this for 20 years. So logically, like, all of the older people at the convent know exactly what's going on. And yet, for some reason, nobody decides to tell Cecilia it's happened before and it ends badly, which is something I think would have actually added some really good tension to the film. I just don't think they pull enough from this idea that everybody else knows she's doomed, other than that random old lady who makes her a charm out of her own hair. It's heavily implied that this lady has been in Cecilia's shoes, down to also trying to run away. So why is she still even at the convent if she's been through that trauma herself? Especially given the first girl who we saw trying to run away ended up being captured and was either killed while giving birth or afterwards by the clergy. Yet for some reason this particular nun, who we know in the past went against the wishes of the convent by trying to escape, is allowed to just hang out there running around being spooky. Like in this scene, she calls her blessed and tells her in an unnecessarily creepy voice, "You will never leave." And yes, you could say she's just fallen deep into it and gone completely mad, but it's completely inconsistent with the only other thing we know about her, which is that she has scars on her feet from attempting to run away. It's so inconsistent, and it just feels like forced tension. The atmosphere could have been so much eerier if Sydney was actually excited to have God's baby if she thought that she had genuinely experienced an immaculate conception. It would give her cause for concern if she believes this is a real miracle, but all the nuns around her are treating her strangely, coldly, and with so much caution. There are better movies in here, and I really do think that Cecilia strongly wanting the baby from the start would have made this a lot more successful. As we then see her go from this excitable, good girl, truly impassioned by God and her faith, to learn what's been done to her was not actually an immaculate conception, but the result of science and scheming, it would shatter her belief and faith. The New York Times review of Immaculate said it had an irreverent hot-button twist and just enough narrative ambiguity to give viewers something to argue about. As to that first bit, having just watched it, my initial reaction was, what twist? Genuinely, I have no idea what part of this film they are, I was about to say accusing of being a twist, that doesn't sound quite right, claiming to be a twist. It was called Immaculate, i.e. Immaculate Conception, so we know that she's going to have a baby. It's obviously been done to her by the controlling church people. It's the most expected and only logical explanation because there are no other people in the story. And we know the baby will either be a god baby or a devil baby. So again, I feel like either way, it's not going to be super unexpected. Nothing that I think you could consider a twist. I pondered if it's the fact that the baby itself is an actual DNA genetic reproduction of Christ. As in other similar movies, it's usually a supernaturally occurring baby. And this feels like it's probably what is most likely to be the twist claimed by the New York Times. But I don't think that is a twist. I think that's just one slight differentiation from other films in this vein. And it also didn't really amount to anything. Like, I would argue that it doesn't work as a twist because it doesn't actually change anything in the direction of the plot. A twist can reveal something that alters a character's perception or the audience's perception, but I feel like it has to alter something. But Sydney was skeptical from the beginning. She didn't really seem chuffed with the situation. So whether it was a God-given baby or something orchestrated by the church using science doesn't really change how she interacts with what's happening to her. Instead, we get Cecilia the meek mouse, seemingly somewhat scared and skeptical from the start of the film. In so many ways, Immaculate chose not to seek out the most interesting version of itself in favor of doing the bare minimum, which allowed them to string together the spooky images that they'd likely already come up with, that didn't really seem to have a place or serve a purpose in this film. To list a few jarring things that stood out to me as imagery for the sake of imagery. First, there were the red-faced evil cult people. Why are they running around doing sneaky stuff when the public-facing clergy is doing sneaky shit anyway? And why do they wear red tights on their faces when it is so conspicuous that if anybody saw them sneaking around, it would immediately raise a red flag that something dodgy was going on? Seemingly, everyone at the convent knows what's going on anyway, and they all seem to be fine with that. They're all staying in the nunnery quite happily. It seems that it's not really required to have secretive figures wearing weird masks enacting some of this stuff. In one scene, the head nun's face is smashed. And sure, a lot of films have face smashes, but it was done in such a way that really reminded me of the old man getting hit in the face with the hammer from Midsommar. It felt like the director just saw Midsommar, thought, that's fucking cool, everybody's talking about it, misunderstood what actually affected people, and decided to just copy and paste it. Again, I'll get into this a bit later, but there is a lot of graphic gore in this that feels kind of out of place given the way they decided to set up the film, whereas it works in Midsommar because all of it is about the painful realities of life. I don't know if that makes sense, but it makes sense to me. During Cecilia's dream sequence, in which I believe she is being inseminated, her face is being rubbed and pulled by all of these hands, and it's probably to allude to the fact that she is being touched in real time outside the dream. But then why is it her face being touched and pulled and not specific parts of her body relevant to pregnancy. It screams, this is a cool shot. Where can it go in my movie? This is where we get into the territory of things that exist just for the sake of the audience. The classic now you see it, now you don't is a frequently used audience-only gimmick. And here we have Isabel disappearing behind a sheet in a single second as Cecilia looks away from her. It somewhat alludes to her being supernatural, or at least that there are supernatural goings-on at the convent. But there aren't. She isn't. It's not communicating to us or to Cecilia that she's a ghost or a vision. The movie just wanted to have one of those classic moments. The reality is she was just looking at her and then she moved. And they didn't need to shoot it this way that makes it seem like she disappeared. That's just for us. The same nun later unalives herself by jumping off of a roof. But why would she unalive herself in such a particular way other than dramatic effect? She also lands and has no skin on her face. And I know skin can come off on impact, but it looked like she had skinned herself before jumping or been attacked by something else. And we never get a reason for her looking like this in the moment. It's just because it is the scariest and most shocking looking thing. There's also the question of why she unalives herself anyway. We get the impression that she was holding out to be in Cecilia's shoes as the person impregnated with Christ. But also right from Sydney's arrival, she's really cold with her, kind of giving the impression that she already knows Sydney is the one who's chosen. Cecilia, not Sydney. Isabel says to Cecilia, "It should have been me," which implies she knew that someone was going to be impregnated. So she appeared to be in the loop about the whole Christ baby situation. Probably in the loop enough that either she would have known that it wasn't going to be her getting impregnated, so why such a shock reaction when it is Cecilia, but also in the loop enough to know that they tried this over and over again with many women, so why doesn't she just wait around until the next try and perhaps she'll be chosen in the future? Her death only exists to have another death in the film, another moment of shock and gore. And of course, sometimes stuff is just for a movie, it's just for us, it's just for fun, it's just for shock. Film is a subjective art. But for me here, as soon as I started asking questions about the things that I didn't like instinctively, I found reasons as to why they didn't really work. I really wish you could see my legs. Oh my god, you could have seen my legs the whole time. I'm about to attempt the impossible and define something that is completely subjective and intangible. Wish me luck. Anyone who has been to film school or similar will be familiar with the parade of Fincher-obsessed fans who are only interested in making blue-filtered crime films and murder mysteries because they want to shoot a scene in the rain where a smoking detective says something like, "Hello, old friend." I really am such a talented actress. To put it simply, there are so many wannabe Finchers and Nolans who grew up on Seven and The Dark Knight and think that they get it. They think that they could make that too. And it's not just Fincher and Nolan. This happens in every genre with every type of film. Even within horror, something as recent as Hereditary, which managed to make contemporary horror seem classy and artistic, but at the same time accessible, has already been endlessly echoed and mimicked. We've seen so many slow, haunting dramas in recent years where the true horror reveals itself to be trauma. My point is, often when someone makes something really good, it makes the rest of us think we can make something really good. But I would argue, in what honestly could be considered quite a negative point of view, that we really don't all have it in us. And I think sometimes in trying to achieve the same heights as the films we love, we risk losing the authenticity that made them so special. We come up against the issue of authenticity. Creative authenticity is something that I value so much, and as it is intangible, as I've already said, it is nearly impossible to determine what is authentic and what isn't. I feel the only answer when we question the authenticity of a work of art or film lies within the author. And if we want to create something meaningful ourselves, we have to have an internal dialogue that questions our own integrity. Why do we want to make movies? And I'm not saying there's an issue with someone who wants to be a filmmaker because they love other aspects, like the technical side, the cinematography, the special effects. Not everyone has to be in it for the storytelling, but also if that's what you're there for, it's totally fine to let that be known. Not every creator has to be an auteur. I don't know why, I actually can't sit normally. The internal question of integrity becomes even more complicated when you consider that some people overlook their genuine connection with their art for the sake of money and success. And frankly, who of us wouldn't take a high-rolling offer if we were asked to adapt the remake of a famed classic? The person writing it isn't always going to be the best person for the job because it is a job. It's not a matter of a brilliant writer rising from nothing on the basis of their beloved work alone. It's a matter of who is writing the work that a studio believes will profit. I also think that sometimes we want so badly to be good at something that we overlook these signs that it's not our strong suit. I love to sing, but I cannot write songs, and everything I've ever attempted sounds like such a weak imitation of Florence and the Machine and Marina and the Diamonds as the two artists that have probably impacted me the most. After a few attempts in my teenage years to make music, I had to reckon with the fact that wanting it wasn't enough to make it real. No amount of wanting meant I was creating anything earnest. I didn't have that hole in my soul that other friends who I knew who were musicians did. I didn't have songs that I felt like I would burst if I didn't get them out of me. And I think wanting to be good at something, here screenwriting and directing, is what so often leads people to borrow and rework pre-existing material, as my terrible 2010 synth ballads prove. Yeah. Nope. There is one more specific aspect of Immaculate that I would like to angrily rant about, and that is its use of pregnancy as horror. Pregnancy horror is kind of its own little genre, and one that actually has surprisingly few entries on looking into it. But what's interesting about pregnancy horror is that its lasting cultural impression has really been created by just one movie, Rosemary's Baby. Also kind of The Omen, but that is obviously more about what comes after the pregnancy. One of my favourite pieces of media, American Horror Story Murder House, borrows heavily from Rosemary's Baby. When Ryan Murphy is in his prime, he knows how to reference and reinterpret the classics. But the most recent entry into the American Horror Story canon is 2024's Delicate. Delicate is another pregnancy horror, but this one sucks really hard. If you will give me a moment to complain, it's basically just Rosemary's Baby remade and worse. Surface level imagery that leads to nothing, like literally so much stuff that's on screen is either not real or it affects nothing. And what's the point of watching something where none of the things that actually happened? They're all just dreams and visions and symbolism that really means nothing to the character because she's in the story and not aware of the wider goings on. Rosemary's Baby has a dreamlike sequence, but we learn that what was happening was real, and we can watch it back and pretty directly go, oh, that's what was going on. Like American Horror Story Delicate, Immaculate also borrows from Rosemary's Baby, with strange, surreal goings-on happening around Cecilia. I've already mentioned the insemination scene, but it begins in a confession box. Cecilia is confessing to a priest, and as she stares through the grate, sees that he's slowly being pulled away from her, as if the confession box is extending or stretching out like a long corridor. And then suddenly hands break through a wall behind her and pull her back. But when she looks up, rather than seeing a wall with a hole in it, she's meters deep in a room with a group full of hooded losers standing over her. The lights are flashing red, and then they stab her in the chest and she wakes up in bed. I have to assume, based on the physical logic, that everything that happened from the confession box onwards was imagined. But why make it something as dull as her being stabbed by a group of hoodies in the hopes possibly that we'd think it was real, but then shoot it in dream logic so we know that it isn't? Us seeing something either way more surreal or a far closer representation of what was actually happening to her in that moment, I think would have been much more frightening. And once the film confirms that its story is not supernatural, this stuff gets even worse, in my opinion, on reflection. And there is a lot of conflict in Immaculate between what is believable, dreamlike, and supernatural. Like, is it scary because it's actually scary, or it's scary because her sanity is slipping away, or it's scary because there is some otherworldly evil force? It feels like throughout the writing process, they didn't really pick one and let that influence what is frightening. I feel like they went down the have your cake and eat it lane of doing stuff that they just thought was cool, rather than picking the lane the film was grounded in and making sure that the film worked in that context. Perhaps it would have been a better film if they let go of the spooky, dreamy surrealism and let it be more like Hostel at a nunnery. It certainly would have been a fresher take, but they seem too attached to the overarching need to combine psychological horror and pregnancy that Rosemary's Baby established. Another issue I had with this film that links back to authenticity is that the film is about a young female nun going through pregnancy and was written and directed by two men. And before anyone gets aggy over this, I obviously think men can write amazing movies about women, and I've talked before about directors who I think do this well and how they achieve that. But Immaculate gave me such a strong sense that the writer and director had a really surface level understanding of what they were writing about. For the majority of people, pregnancy is a female experience and something that women will understand best. Something we grow up obsessing over and fearing because it is a real possibility for us. It's something that really will one day potentially happen to our bodies, and sometimes against our will, which is undoubtedly a really frightening concept. I appreciate when men choose to put women at the center of their projects, but I think Immaculate does suffer as a male observation of a female-specific fear. It's another one of those topics where I do question why men choose to write about it, as it doesn't give them an outlet to disentangle and process their own anxieties and fears as men. To bring it back to Rosemary, I feel like, especially because that film was made by a man and is so successful and beloved, I know I for one love it, it's become the blueprint that allows other men to feel like they could make pregnancy horror too, and they could make an amazing film out of it. But when you try to tell a story that you've only observed, you always run the risk of lacking perspective, and pregnancy becomes just the material. Wrapping up my complaints about Immaculate, when we finally get to the end, they meow out of, is that good self-censorship? They out of showing us what she gave birth to. And to me, that at this point is not suspense or ambiguity. It's what we've been waiting for. Reward us with something. Otherwise, I've just waited this whole movie to see Sydney Sweeney screaming and crying. I've seen Euphoria. I've seen it before. Show me a baby. Sorry, I'm feeling very passionate. And the cherry on top of that, to have Cecilia kill the baby when we don't even know what it is, ruins what would have been an emotional connection. Because it's the moment we could have connected with the life that was growing inside of her. When we feel the weight of her deciding to kill it, because we're looking at it, and it's looking at Sydney, and Sydney is looking at the baby, and we're all looking at each other. To destroy it then has some emotional gravity. But instead, she pushes out what, for all we know, could be a balloon and then bursts it. We know why she does it. She's bloody angry and not gonna let anyone else have autonomy over her body or force her into a decision she didn't make. And I can guess that the writers felt like this made her a more modern, strong character by not having her feel maternal emotions in this moment. I understand the decision from that perspective, but good or bad, we don't really feel what she's feeling in that moment because we don't see the collateral of her choice. So, Obviously, everything that I've said in this video is subjective, but I would merit a guess that if you don't have the issues that I've talked about with Immaculate, that it's likely you have felt the same about another movie at some point in time. Overused ideas, hollow images, stories made by people who don't understand the subject matter and just see it as meat for their movie. These are complaints I hear often. Sometimes I hear them about films that I loved. And critiquing a film's failures is all well and good, but what is the point if we're unable to learn from it? I think if we ever strive to create things ourselves, we have to ask, what can we do to avoid repeating the failures we've observed in other works? And regarding Immaculate specifically, the question I have to ask is, how do we avoid making movies that simply feel like empty echoes of other people's films? Most people who end up being directors love movies. Many directors will intentionally reference and make homage to films they love. In some ways, it's inevitable in the cycle of creation and consumption. There is an idea that I've come across before that defines inspiration as when you collect and accumulate so many different ideas, gathering them together, that you are able to transform them into something new, something unrecognizable. And this is what differentiates something being inspired by something versus something that is simply a weak imitation or a copy. When you do this right, a film might have the same feeling as something that already exists. It might remind us of something else in a fleeting moment. But people shouldn't be able to take the final piece of work, strip it down, and point out where the different elements came from. I think this description gives us a good starting place for any creative to not have a singular inspiration. But I think to make the best art, really we should be drawing away from cinema as an inspiration, full stop. The best works of not just cinema, but art and fashion and music are built upon life. I think this often when I watch Drag Race, that sometimes you see a queen that claims to be a fashion queen, but they just don't feel like a fashion queen. Something is off. And that's because every look is based off a Westwood or a Mugler or Galliano. They're simply referencing the idea of fashion, mimicking someone else's originality, rather than themselves finding their inspirations from nature, a foreign country, from a loved one, from an emotion. There are so many parts of life that can inspire our art. So why limit yourself as a filmmaker to being inspired by other films? And I think it takes a lot for someone to have the level of self-reflection that says, is this really coming from inside of me? When I was a teenager, I wrote a bunch of scripts about pregnancy and abortion and church and cults because I grew up in the church and I felt like these things were authentic inspirations to me. I felt I had the justification to say, these are my stories and I have real inspiration. But the reality is, I didn't. I wasn't coming home from church challenged by something said in a sermon or inspired by something I'd read in the Bible and then looking into it, doing my research and creating stories. I was 15 watching American Horror Story Asylum, connecting to the work because it did have some real connection to my life, but then simply mimicking what had already been said and done, in the vein of both imagery and ideology. And the crux of that led me to creating stories that were essentially impersonal to me. I feel like I've already said this exact sentence like 3 times in this video. You, of course, are allowed to be inspired by movies, but if you're a filmmaker, I think these are really important questions to ask yourself, and a good way of assessing your own creative process, because it shows in the final result. And I think many of us can recognize that when we look back at the work we've created in our teens or early 20s, and now we cringe at it and feel embarrassed because we recognize the inauthenticity. As is probably clear, this film really rubbed me the wrong way. I don't really like knocking other people's artistic works down, And I also think that filmmaking is really, really hard, which is something I don't think a lot of film criticism acknowledges. It's actually so difficult to make a good movie. And I don't know if I could ever do any better. So much goes into making a film. You have to be good at so many things. So for the most part, I'm pretty forgiving with bad movies. But this movie has a lot of issues that I think other creatives can learn from. We've reached a very confused place when it comes to creating authentically, and this is just as pervasive in our daily lives. In some ways, it feels like we don't know how to live without subconsciously replicating things from the media we've spent a lifetime consuming. When you're feeling sad and destructive, do you take a swig out of a bottle of vodka alone in your room because you feel like it, or because you've seen it in the movies so it feels like the right response? Do you look dreamily out the window on a road trip because you're really observing the clouds or the trees, or because you're looking back on yourself thinking how dreamy the moment is? Thinking about how it looks from beyond the fourth wall. To tie this all back into a beautiful little knot, I think that as writers, artists, musicians, whatever it is, we owe it to ourselves to create earnestly, to be inspired by life itself and not other pieces of media we've spent our own lifetimes consuming, and to have the guts to be critical of the root of our own creations. Has it really been born out of something true, or are our ideas just echoes of other people's? If all you do is copy and cultivate other people's work, then will you really see yourself in your project at the end of the day? Everything I've done so far to make this video has gone wrong, so that's been great. Ooh, look, legs.